Bien, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vais juste dire, on a un peu de retard et on s'en excuse, je vais juste dire deux phrases en anglais pour souhaiter la bienvenue à monsieur Chomsky et pour faire un certain nombre de remerciements. Ça ne prendra pas plus de 2 minutes. So, I will start. So, it's great pleasure and honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce the conference of Mr. Chomsky. And first, I would like to sincerely thank you for coming and giving us the chance to listen you and to debate with you. So thank you very much, Mr. Chomsky. Donc ces quelques mots étaient en anglais, servent aussi à décomplexer tous les francophones. Plus sérieusement, je me dois et je tiens absolument à remercier la BnF qui nous prête ce magnifique auditorium pour cette venue et qui a mobilisé ses équipes techniques et également à l'accueil. Je dois me remercier aussi M. Florent Monteclair et Sophie Vauquier, qui va arriver sur scène dans pas très longtemps, ainsi que le service de communication de Paris Lumières pour l'organisation de cette conférence. Je pense que c'est un moment assez privilégié pour nous. Et juste une phrase de conclusion, je tiens à dire que, d'une part, la probité, la rigueur intellectuelle de M. Chomsky participe, je pense sincèrement, à notre compréhension du monde contemporain et surtout, à mon sens, au monde parfois inquiétant qui se dessine pour demain. Et je crois que c'est un moment important pour nous tous. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je dirais juste un petit mot pour expliquer dans quel cadre Monsieur Chomsky vient cette semaine à Paris. Il existe une société internationale de philologie qui regroupe à peu près 200 universités anglophones qui, constituées sur le modèle de l'Union internationale des mathématiciens, délivre tous les 5 ans une médaille. C'est la médaille Field pour les mathématiques, c'est la médaille d'or de philologie pour cette société. Et les grands noms de la grammaire figurent dans les lauréats. C'est une médaille qui se demande au terme d'un concours, mais cette année, la 10e médaille, et la société a décidé de solliciter Noam Chomsky et de lui demander s'il accepterait d'être le lauréat de cette 10e médaille. Il a accepté, et comme je suis le dernier récipiendaire de cette médaille et que je suis donc français, c'est à l'Assemblée nationale qu'il recevra mercredi prochain des mains de Goran Malmvik, le président de la société, et du président Claude Barthelone, cette médaille. Je tiens à remercier la BnF, bien sûr, et son directeur, le président de Paris Lumières, ainsi que Sophie Vauquier de l'organisation de cette conférence, qui est donc parallèle à cette cérémonie officielle. Et en fidèle adepte de Dumas, je fais 3 remerciements, mais il y en a un 4e. Je remercierai Dalia Alioun, qui est ici, qui nous servira de traductrice.
Thank you. In the early days of the modern scientific revolution, Galileo and his contemporaries issued a crucial challenge to those concerned with the nature of human language and thought, a challenge that was scarcely recognized until it was taken up in the mid-20th century, and it became the primary concern for those interested in these topics. So for short, I'll refer to it as the Galilean challenge. These great founders of modern science expressed their awe and their wonder at the fact, I'll quote, paraphrase, that language permits us to construct from 25 or 30 sounds an infinite variety of expressions which, although not having any resemblance in themselves to that which passes through our minds, nevertheless reveals all the secrets of the mind and makes intelligible to others who cannot penetrate into the mind all that we conceive and all of the diverse movements of our souls. I'm slightly paraphrasing the formulation by Arnaud and Lancelot in their Grammaire Générale, the clearest and most perceptive formulation. We can now see that the Galilean challenge requires some qualifications, but it's very real, and I think it should be recognized as one of the deepest insights in the rich history of 2,500 years of inquiry into language and mind. The challenge has been almost completely ignored, but not entirely. The most important exception is Descartes, who was, of course, one of the influences on the Grammaire Générale. For Descartes, a primary basis for the postulation of mind as a new creative principle was the human capacity for unbounded and appropriate use of language in ways that we are incited and inclined to produce, but not compelled in the Cartesian terminology. In later years, there's occasional recognition that language is a creative activity that involves infinite use of finite means. That's Wilhelm von Humboldt's formulation, and sometimes others. And there has also been awareness that these capacities are a species property shared by humans generally and unique to humans. And in fact, the most striking feature of this curious organism and a foundation for its remarkable achievements. But there has never been much to say beyond a few phrases. And there's a good reason why the insights languished until the mid-20th century. Intellectual tools were not available for even formulating the problem in a clear way, in a clear enough way to address it seriously. That changed thanks to the work of Alan Turing, other great mathematicians, mid-20th century, who established the general theory of computability on a firm basis. In particular, they showed how a finite object like the brain can generate an infinite variety of expressions. And it then becomes possible, actually for the first time, to address at least part of the Galilean challenge directly, although regrettably the earlier history was entirely unknown at that time, only discovered 15, 20 years later. With these intellectual tools available, it becomes possible to formulate what we may call the basic property of human language. The language faculty of the human brain provides the means to construct a digitally infinite array of structured expressions, each of which is semantically interpreted as expressing a thought, and each of which can be externalized in some sensory modality. The infinite array of semantically interpreted objects constitutes what has sometimes been called a language of thought, the system of thoughts that receive linguistic expression, that enter into mental acts, reflection, inference, planning, other mental processes, and when they're externalized, can be used for social interactions. Though this is actually only a first approximation to what may be called thought. There's much more to say about this challenging topic, but I'll put it aside here. There's good reason to suppose that the language faculty is indeed a common human possession shared among humans. There are no known group differences in language capacity. There's some individual variation, but very much at the margins. We now know that although speech is the usual form of sensory motor externalization, it's by no means necessary. It can equally well be sign, even in fact touch. That these discoveries in the past generation require a slight formulation of the Galilean challenge. It's not necessarily a matter of 25 or 30 sounds. There's a more fundamental qualification. That has to do with the way the challenge is formulated in the 17th century and, in fact, throughout history. It's formulated in terms of production of expressions. That is indeed the traditional formulation. And in these terms, the challenge overlooks some basic issues. Production, like perception, accesses the internal language, but cannot be identified with it. We have to distinguish the internalized system of knowledge from the systems that access it in action, in use. And the theory of computability enables us to formulate this distinction, and it's an important one. It's familiar in other domains. So consider, for example, human arithmetical competence. In studying it, we routinely distinguish the internal system of knowledge, which in principle gives us the answer to the product of any two integers that we pick. We distinguish that from the actions that access this internal system, so like multiplying numbers in our head, which involves many other factors apart from the internal knowledge, memory constraints, for example. And the same is true of language. Production and perception, the uses of language, access the internal language, but involve other factors as well, including, again, short-term memory. These are matters that began to be studied with some care as soon as the Galilean challenge was formulated and addressed in the 1950s. There has since been considerable progress in understanding the nature of the internal language, but its free creative use, what concerned Descartes, Galileo, Arnaud, and others, that remains a mystery. And that comes as no surprise. There's a recent review of the state of the art concerning far simpler cases of voluntary action in a recent article by two leading researchers, neuroscientists Emilio Bizzi, Robert Ajemian, and they write that we're beginning to learn something about the puppet and the strings, but the puppeteer remains shrouded in mystery. And that's even more dramatically true for such creative acts as the normal use of language, the unique human capacity that so impressed the founders of modern science, and remains a mystery. The fundamental task of inquiry into language is to determine the nature of the basic property. That means the genetic endowment that underlies the faculty of language, again, a unique and specific human property. To the extent that the basic property is understood, to that extent we can begin to investigate particular internal languages, each of which is an instantiation of the basic property, much as each individual visual system is an instantiation of the shared human faculty of vision. And we can investigate further how internal languages are acquired and used, how the language faculty itself evolved, its basis in human genetics, and the ways in which it functions in the human brain. This general program of research has been called the biolinguistic program. The theory of the genetically based language faculty has in modern years been called universal grammar. The theory of each individual language is called its generative grammar. These observations are often considered controversial, the ideas, but they shouldn't be. They're close to truisms, I think. Languages appear to be extremely complex, varying radically from one another. And indeed, a standard belief among professional linguists 60 years ago was that languages can vary in arbitrary ways, and each must be studied without preconceptions. Similar views, I'm quoting from Martin J. Jost, leading theoretical linguist, similar views were held at the time about organisms generally. So many biologists 60 years ago would have agreed with well-known molecular biologist Gunther Stent, who concluded that the variability of organisms is so free as to constitute a near infinitude of particulars which have to be sorted out case by case. And quite generally, when understanding is thin, we expect to see extreme variety and complexity. And a great deal has been learned since. Within biology, it's now recognized that the variety of life forms is very limited, so much so that the hypothesis of a universal genome for all life forms has been quite seriously advanced. My own feeling is that linguistics has undergone a similar development in the past 60 years along lines that I'll indicate. The basic property takes language to be a computational system, which we therefore expect to meet general conditions on computational efficiency. What's a computational system? A computational system consists of a set of atomic elements and rules to construct more complex ones. So for the generation of the language of thought, the atomic elements are word-like, though not exactly words. For each language, the set of these elements is what's called its lexicon. The lexical elements are commonly regarded as cultural products, varying widely with experience, linked to extramental entities. So the word tree is linked to trees. The latter assumption about the linkage is expressed in the titles of standard works like W.V. Quine's influential study, Word and Object. Closer examination reveals a very different picture, both with regard to the concept of cultural products and with regard to the linkage. I'll want actually a picture that poses many mysteries. I'll put that aside until later, turning first to the computational procedure. Well, clearly we seek the simplest computational procedure that'll be consistent with the data of language. The reasons are implicit in the basic goals of scientific inquiry. It's long been understood that simplicity of theory translates directly into depth of explanation. A more specific reason for the quest for simplicity was provided by a famous dictum of Galileo's, which has in fact guided the sciences since their modern origins. The dictum that nature is simple, and it's the task of the scientist to demonstrate this, from the motion of the planets to the flight of an eagle, to the inner workings of a cell, to the growth of language in the mind of the child. And linguistics has an additional motive of its own for seeking the simplest theory. Linguistics has to face the problem of evolvability. Not a great deal is known about the evolution of modern humans, but the few facts that are well established and others that have recently been coming to light are quite suggestive, and they conform very well to the conclusion that the language faculty is very simple, perhaps even near optimal for a computational system, which is, of course, the goal that we should be seeking on purely methodological grounds. One fact that is well established, I've already mentioned, the fact that the faculty of language is a true species property, invariant among human groups, furthermore, unique to humans in its essential properties. I think that is very well established. And it follows that there's been little or no evolution of this faculty since human groups began to separate from one another. There are recent genomic studies which place the separation date not very long after the appearance of anatomically modern humans. It's about 200,000 years ago. The beginning of the separation is the San group in Africa, who separated from other humans. There's no evidence about of the existence of anything remotely like a human language or symbolic behavior generally before the emergence of modern humans. And that leads us to expect that the faculty of language emerged along with modern humans, or at least before the separation of the San group, which is maybe 150,000 years ago, so almost the time of the emergence of modern humans. That's a very brief moment in evolutionary time. And it follows then that the basic property should indeed be very simple. That conclusion conforms pretty well to what's been discovered in recent years about the basic property, about the nature of language, which is a very welcome convergence between the study of evolution of humans and the study of the nature of their core cognitive faculty, language. So these discoveries about the recent discoveries about the early separation of the San people are highly suggestive. They do appear to share the general human language capacity, but they happen to have significantly different externalized languages. With irrelevant exceptions, the San languages are all and only the languages that have phonetic clicks, and there are some corresponding adaptations in the vocal tract. The most likely explanation for these facts, which is developed in detail in current work in press, in fact, by Dutch linguist Rini Huybrechts, the obvious explanation is that possession of internal language preceded separation, which in turn preceded externalization, the latter, externalization, in somewhat different ways in separated groups. Externalization seems to be associated with the first indications of symbolic behavior in the archaeological record after the separation. And putting all these observations together, it seems that we're reaching a stage in understanding how evolution, the account of evolution of language, can be fleshed out in ways that were unimaginable until quite recently, actually this year to be precise. Returning to the basic property, the genetic endowment for the computational system of language, and that's what we're looking at, we have reason to believe that it's quite simple. And a major challenge for research then is to show how the superficially diverse and complex facts of language can be accounted for in terms of a simple formulation of the basic property. More fully, that would mean by the basic property and its interaction with specific experience and language-independent principles, including the principles of computational efficiency, language, and in fact, organism-independent. That challenge becomes of particular interest and significance when it's clear that the child's experience provides little or no relevant evidence, which is a situation that's far more prevalent than commonly realized, so careful examination reveals, from acquisition of the meaning of simple words onto syntactic structures and the semantic properties of the generated system of thought. For example, it's been shown quite recently by Charles Yang on the basis of extensive statistical analysis of inputs to children that very few children even have access to the entire paradigm, verbal paradigm, within their lifetime. But of course, they all know it instantly. And it goes on well beyond that. Also of particular interest are the universal properties of the language faculty. These began to come to light as soon as serious efforts were undertaken to construct generative grammars back in the 1950s, including quite simple properties that had never been noticed and that are quite puzzling when you think about them. One such property is what's called structure dependence. The rules that yield the language of thought attend solely to structural properties. They ignore properties of the externalized signal, even such simple properties as linear order. There are very simple illustrations of this. So take, for example, ordinary conjunction. The sentence, for example, the boy and the girl are here. Notice that it's are here, not is here, although the closest local relation is girl plus copula, which would be girl is. And if you look at bigram frequencies, the bigram frequency of word phrases like girl is vastly higher than phrases like girl are. That doesn't appear. That's a common measure that's used in computational cognitive science and big data analysis, mistakenly in my view, but it would clearly give the wrong answer in this case. Without any instruction, every child relies on structure, not linearity, takes the phrase, not the local noun, to determine agreement. And that's true quite generally, for example, for structural ambiguity, like the sentence, he saw the man with the telescope, ambiguous depending on what you take to be the phrases by the structure, though the pronunciation and the linear order do not change, and there are innumerable examples like this. Just to select one somewhat more subtle example, consider the phrase, birds that fly instinctively swim. It's ambiguous. The adverb instinctively can be associated with the previous verb, fly instinctively, or the following verb, instinctively swim. Suppose now we extract the adverb, forming instinctively birds that fly swim. Now the ambiguity is resolved. The adverb is construed only with the linear, more remote, but structurally closer verb swim, not with the linearly closer but structurally more remote verb fly. The only possible interpretation is that birds instinctively swim, which happens to be the unnatural interpretation, but that doesn't matter. The rules apply rigidly, independently of meaning, independently of fact, and also, and this is the puzzling part, the rules ignore the simple computation of linear order, and they keep to the far more complex computation of structural distance. Now, that's a puzzling fact. This property of structure dependence holds for all constructions in all languages. Furthermore, it's known without any relevant evidence. That's quite clear from the cases like the ones I mentioned. And experiments show that children understand all of this. They understand that all rules are structure dependent as early as they can be tested, which is about age 3. And of course, they have no instruction. So we can be quite confident then that the principle of structure dependence follows from principles of universal grammar that are deeply rooted in the human language faculty and are in fact genetically determined. I might add on the side that structure dependence is one of the very few cases, very few non-trivial properties of language that usage-based approaches to language have sought to account for. The attempts have been reviewed in detail elsewhere. I won't run through them. They all fail totally, and in fact most of them are not even asking the right question, namely, why is it that this property holds for all languages and all constructions, even if unimaginably you could show that data is available for children in English wouldn't tell you anything. Why does it hold for all languages and all constructions? There are other attempts which have been made by usage-based approaches. They fare no better, in my opinion, but I'll put that aside here. There is evidence from other sources that supports the conclusion that structure dependence is a true universal, true linguistic universal, deeply rooted in language design, evidence from neuroscience and psycholinguistics. So research conducted in Milan about a decade ago, initiated by Andrea Moro, many of you know, showed that invented languages which keep to the principle of structure dependence elicit normal activation in the language areas of the brain. But much simpler systems using linear order in violation of these principles yield diffuse activation of the brain, which implies that experimental subjects are treating them as a puzzle, not a language. Similar results had already been found by Neil Smith and Ianthi Tsimpley in their investigation of a cognitively deficient but linguistically gifted subject. They also made the quite interesting observation that normals can solve the problem if it's presented to them as a puzzle, but not if it's presented to them as a language, which would presumably activate the language faculty. The only plausible conclusion, again, from all of this material is that structure dependence is an innate property of the language faculty, which at once, of course, raises the question why that should be so. Why is it the case that universally, without instruction, the children know that they have to carry out the structurally complex operation, the computationally complex operation of looking at structure, not the computationally simple process of looking at linear order? Why does everyone know that? There's only one known answer to this, and fortunately, it's the answer that we seek for general reasons. Namely, the computational operations of language are the simplest possible ones. That may seem puzzling, but when you think about generation, you can see why it works out. Notice again that that's the outcome that we want to reach on methodological grounds, and it's to be expected in the light of the evidence about the evolution of language, which I already mentioned. Well, to see why this is the case, just consider the simplest recursive operation, which gives a digitally infinite array of structured expressions, an operation that's embedded in one way or another in all other recursive operations. This operation takes two objects which are already constructed, call them X and Y, and it forms a new object, Z, but without modifying either X or y, and without adding any further structure. That's the simplest possible combinatorial operation. And if you think about it, that means that Z, the thing constructed, is just the set consisting of X and Y. In current work, that operation is called merge. And notice that since merge imposes no order, the objects that are constructed, however complex, will be hierarchically structured but unordered, and operations on them will necessarily keep the structural distance, ignoring linear distance. So it follows that all linguistic operations that yield the language of thought will be structure dependent, as indeed is the case, resolving the puzzle, explaining why children know it automatically. They simply use the computationally simplest operation, and notice that the puzzle is resolved in the way we want by showing that it follows from the simplest assumptions. Well, there are further consequences. Externalization of language maps internal structures into some sensory modality, some sensory motor modality, usually speech, but not necessarily. The sensory motor system requires linear order. You can't speak in parallel, you can't speak structures. But none of this seems to enter into the generation of the language of thought, which keeps to structural relations. It's a rather surprising and far-reaching conclusion. More generally, externalization of language seems to be a peripheral aspect of language, doesn't enter into its core function of providing a language of thought. That's contrary to a long tradition, including, in fact, the formulation of the Galilean challenge. And perception, study of perception, yields further evidence in support of this conclusion. So the auditory system of apes happens to be quite similar to that of humans. It's even attuned to the phonetic features that are used in language, distinctive features. But the shared auditory perceptual system leaves apes without anything remotely like the human faculty of language. Apes can, of course, gesture, but even with arduous training, they can't use their gestural systems with even the most elementary properties of language, though as now known, sign languages, which use gesture, are in fact developed spontaneously by humans, even without any linguistic input. Similarly, recent research with dogs has found that they're attuned to phonological and intonational features of language, and they even may have hemispheric specialization similar to humans, but of course that provides no step at all towards acquisition of language. And many such results give further support to the conclusion that internal language is independent of externalization, and that internal language evolved quite independently of the processes of externalization, which appear to have developed later on, maybe tens of thousands of years later on. The most powerful evidence, however, is what we learn from investigation of language design. One crucial example is the one I just mentioned, the explanation for the puzzle posed by structure dependence, which again follows from the null hypothesis that the computational system is optimal and hence ignores linear order, the most elementary feature of externalization. Well, not long ago, it would have seemed absurd to propose that the operations of human language can be reduced to merge, along with language-independent principles of computational efficiency. But work of the past few years has shown that quite intricate properties of language follow directly from this assumption, along with a few other quite simple assumptions. One important result has to do with the property of displacement. It's a ubiquitous feature of language and a quite puzzling one. This means that phrases are heard in one position in a sentence, but they're interpreted both there and in some other position, which is silent, but where they could have occurred. That's a puzzling property. It's never built into artificial symbolic systems for metamathematics, for programming, or for other purposes. So, for example, take the sentence, which book will you read? It's interpreted as meaning, roughly, for which book X you will read the book X. The nominal phrase, book, is heard in one position, but interpreted in two positions. That's ubiquitous in language. I won't go into the details, but it's easy to show that merge-based computation automatically yields displacement with copies. In this case, two copies of which book, which yields the semantic interpretation directly. And that same process yields quite intricate semantic interpretations. To see how it works, consider, for example, the sentence, the boys expect to see each other. Okay? And the same sentence preceded by which girls? Which girls do the boys expect to see each other? In the latter sentence, each other, the anaphor, does not refer back to the closest antecedent, the boys, as such phrases universally do, but rather to the more remote antecedent, which girls. So the sentence means, which girls for which girls the boy expected those girls to see each other, not those boys. That's what reaches the mind, for which girls the boys expected those girls to see each other. Now, that's what reaches the mind under merge-based computation with automatic copies, though it's not what reaches the ear. What reaches the ear violates the locality condition of referential dependency. And deletion of the copy in externalization causes quite serious processing problems. And these are what are called filler gap problems. And they can become quite severe and are among the most difficult problems of automatic parsing and of perception. If the copy were not deleted, the problem would be much less severe. So why then is it deleted? Well, again, because principles of efficient computation require that we should reduce what is computed to the minimum. You can't eliminate all copies, or there would be no indication that displacement even took place. So what's done is to eliminate all but one copy, structurally most prominent one, that leaves a gap, more complex cases, many gaps, that have to be filled by the hearer, which is a matter that can become quite intricate. And examples like these illustrate a general phenomenon which is of some significance. Language design appears to maximize computational efficiency, but it disregards communicative efficiency. In fact, in every known case in which computational and communicative efficiency conflict, and there are many such cases, in every such case, communicative efficiency is ignored. Structural ambiguities, another such case, and there are many others. These facts conflict with the common belief that communication is the basic function of language. They also further undermine continuity assumptions about language having evolved from animal communication. And they provide further evidence that externalization, which is of course necessary for communication, is a peripheral aspect of language. Well, as I mentioned, there are methodological reasons and also some evolutionary reasons to expect that the basic design of language, internal language, will be quite simple, perhaps even close to optimal. With regard to externalization of language, the same methodological arguments apply, they always do, but the evolutionary arguments do not apply. In fact, externalization of language may not involve evolution at all. The sensory motor systems were in place long before the appearance of language, hundreds of thousands of years before. And mapping the internal language to some sensory motor system for externalization poses a hard cognitive problem, the problem of relating two systems that are unrelated. The internal system may be highly efficient computationally, maybe even close to optimal. The sensory modality is completely unrelated to it. That would lead us to expect that the variety, the complexity, the easy mutability of observed language use might lie primarily in externalization, and maybe even totally in externalization. And increasingly, it seems to be becoming clear that that's the case. It would mean that the internal language is virtually fixed, maybe close to optimal, and the variety and complexity come from the hard cognitive problem of mapping this recently developed, recently evolved internal system into sensory motor modalities that had been around already for hundreds of thousands of years. And in fact, something like this is actually to be expected, contrary to standard beliefs. The reason is that the principles of internal language are largely known to children without evidence, as in the structure dependence case that I mentioned, or the case of referential dependency, many others. And that's indeed is true of a great deal more about language, including almost all semantic and most syntactic properties. These, I should say, are matters of contention, but in my view at least, they're pretty solidly established. There's by now some reason to believe that the emerging science of neurolinguistics might even one of these days go so far as to identify the brain circuits that underlie the computational system. There's been a great deal of promising work in the last few years. Particularly, a lot of it is reviewed in a forthcoming book by neuroscientist Angela Frederici. Happens to be appearing fortuitously on the 50th anniversary of Eric Lenneberg's now classic study that inaugurated the field of biology of language, 1967. And Frederici's own work leads her to some bold and quite challenging proposals. So she provides evidence that a crucial element in linguistic computation is a white matter, a dorsal fiber tract that connects a specific region in Broca's area, actually part of what's called BA44, to those of you who know the neurotomy, connects this specific region to the posterior temporal cortex, and she suggests, I'll quote her, that this pathway might be the missing link which has to evolve in order to make the full language capacity possible. This conclusion is supported by some comparative evidence. Turns out that the dorsal pathway is very weak in macaques and chimpanzees, and also is weak and poorly myelinated in newborn human infants, but it's strong in adult humans with language mastery. And she also reviews a collection of experiments that indicate that the increasing strength of this pathway through age, quoting her, correlates directly with the increasing ability to process complex syntactic structures. And a variety of experimental results that she reviews suggest that, quoting again, this fiber tract may thus be one of the reasons for the difference in the language ability in human adults as compared with pre-linguistic infants and monkeys. These structures, again, Frederici suggests, appear to have evolved to subserve the human capacity to process syntax, which is at the core of the human language faculty. I think, in general, these are bold and contentious proposals, but I think that they indicate that quite intriguing discoveries might be forthcoming in these domains in coming years, particularly as the technology is improving. Well, let's return finally to the second component of a computational system, the atomic elements. For language, that means the lexical elements. Well, as I mentioned, the conventional view is that these are cultural products and that the most basic ones, the ones used for referring to the world, are associated with extra mental entities. So the word tree is associated with extra mental trees. That so-called representationalist doctrine has been almost universally adopted in the modern period in linguistics and philosophy of language and mind and cognitive science. The doctrine does appear to hold for animal communication. So a monkey's calls, for example, are associated with specific extramental physical events. But the doctrine is radically false for human language. Now, that actually was recognized as far back as classical Greece. So to illustrate, let's take the first case that was discussed in pre-Socratic philosophy, the problem that was posed by Heraclitus. How can we cross the same river twice? What makes it the same river, even though it's physically quite different? And to put it differently, the way it was looked at by Locke and Hume and others in the 17th century, 17th, 18th centuries, why are two appearances understood to be two stages of the same river? That's actually quite a puzzle. When we look into the puzzle, turns out it's much more complex even than was recognized by the philosophers who looked at it most closely, like Locke and Hume. So suppose, for example, that the flow of the river has been reversed, goes in the opposite direction, still the same river. Suppose that what's flowing becomes 95% arsenic from discharges from an upstream plant, still the same river. The same is true of other quite radical changes in the physical object. You can play with it in your own thought experiments. On the other hand, with very slight changes, the object will no longer be a river at all. So suppose its sides are lined with fixed barriers and it's used for oil tankers. And now it's a canal, not a river. Suppose the surface undergoes a very slight, physically almost undetectable phase change and is hardened, becomes glassy, and a line is painted down the middle and it's used to commute to town. Now it's a highway, not a river at all. Well, when you explore the matter further, you discover that what counts as a river depends on mental acts and constructions. A physicist looking at what we call a river couldn't give the answer unless they were able to look into what our minds are doing. It's different from animal cries. And the same is true quite generally of even the most elementary concepts. So tree, water, house, person, London, in fact, any of the basic words of human language. So unlike animals, the items of human language and thought uniformly violate the representationalist doctrine, which is almost universally taken for granted in modern work on the topic. Incidentally, for such reasons as these, the now popular deep learning approaches based on big data and statistical analysis, which are based on object recognition, they cannot in principle discover the meanings of words, as is hoped by the massive research projects underway by Google and others. They can't work in principle. We know it in advance. Furthermore, the intricate knowledge of the meanings of even the simplest words, like what I just mentioned, let alone more complex ones, all of that is acquired without experience. Obviously true in the case of what I just said about river, but in fact quite general. So you go to peak periods of language acquisition, children are acquiring words at a rate of about 1 an hour. Now that is typically on one presentation, but they know the rich meaning. So it must be that the rich meaning of even the most elementary words is substantially innate, and the evolutionary origin of such distinctively human concepts is a complete mystery, one that may not even be resolvable by means available to us. Well, returning now to the Galilean challenge, it has to be reformulated, first to distinguish language from speech, more fundamentally to distinguish production from internal language, the latter an internal computational system that yields a language of thought, a system that might be computationally remarkably simple, which conforms to what the evolutionary record suggests. There are secondary processes which maps the internal structures of language to one or another sensory motor system for externalization. These secondary processes appear to be the locus of the complexity and variety of linguistic behavior and its mutability over time. The origin of the atoms of computation remains a complete mystery, as does a major question that concerned those who formulated the Galilean challenge, namely the Cartesian question, the Poiret question, Galileo's question of how language can be used in the normal creative way, in a manner that's appropriate to situations but not caused by them, incited and inclined but not compelled in Cartesian terms. And that mystery, as I mentioned, holds even for the most simple forms of voluntary action, like lifting your finger, as I mentioned earlier. Well, a great deal has been learned about language since the biolinguistic program was initiated in the 1950s. I think it's fair to say that more has been learned about the nature of language and about a very wide variety of typologically different languages than in the entire 2,500-year prior history of inquiry into language. New questions have arisen, some of them quite puzzling, and there are some surprising answers, which lead us to revise what has long been believed about language and mental processes generally. But as is familiar in the sciences, the more you learn, the more you discover what you do not know, and the more puzzling it often seems. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup. J'aurais dû tout à l'heure introduire scientifiquement Noam Chomsky, mais tout le monde il n'avait absolument pas besoin de mon introduction intellectuelle. Tout le monde connaît l'éminent linguiste, le grand intellectuel engagé, la manière dont il a marqué et dont il marque le paysage intellectuel international et l'importance de sa visite pour nous ici en France. Je voudrais le remercier tout particulièrement puisqu'il est en France essentiellement pour des raisons privées, pour venir chercher également sa médaille, la médaille qui va lui être remise par la Société de philologie. Et il a choisi néanmoins, il a été proposé une conférence scientifique ici pour nos étudiants, pour nos collègues. Et vraiment, nous voudrions vraiment le remercier de venir nous faire bénéficier de son savoir. Je voudrais remercier tout particulièrement l'UPL, donc Pierre-André Jouvet et également Louis-Nicolas Doumé de l'UPL dans un temps aussi court d'avoir pu mobiliser des moyens pour nous aider à organiser cela, et également la BnF qui nous a accueillis dans de très belles conditions. Voilà. Et la dernière chose que je voudrais dire, c'est qu'il est intéressant et touchant et encourageant pour les jeunes linguistes français que Noam Chomsky vienne aujourd'hui ici en France et à l'Université Paris 8 et à l'UPL, dans la mesure où l'aventure générative en France a commencé à Vincennes, avec notamment Maurice Gross, Nicolas Ruvet, Richie Kane, et puis ensuite d'autres générations de chercheurs et de collègues qui ont progressivement permis de créer une tradition générative en France, alors que ce n'était pas le paradigme dominant à ce moment-là. Donc, Lélia Picabia, Anne Hertz, Alain Rouvray, Hans Obenauer, Pierre Picard, Jean-Yves Pollock, tous nos collègues, et maintenant nos jeunes collègues qui ont été formés partout en France et qui continuent à travailler sur ces domaines. Donc, merci Noam Chomsky et merci à tous ceux qui nous ont aidés à le recevoir aujourd'hui et à ce que de nouvelles générations d'étudiants et de collègues puissent bénéficier en direct de son enseignement et de son éclat intellectuel, de tout ce qu'il peut nous apporter intellectuellement. Voilà. Alors, nous allons prendre des questions. Nous avons un peu de temps pour les questions. Donc, ici, nous sommes dans un contexte scientifique, donc nous ne prendrons pas de questions politiques qui pourront être éventuellement... vous pourrez en prendre connaissance puisqu'il sera le rédacteur en chef d'un numéro spécial de l'Humanité mercredi prochain. Et par ailleurs, la semaine prochaine, lors de la remise de médailles, il y aura éventuellement, je crois, une intervention dans un registre plus politique la semaine prochaine. Donc nous prenons maintenant des questions scientifiques et je vous écoute. Le temps de parole est à vous maintenant. Voilà. Oui. Alors je pense qu'il y a un micro sans fil normalement.
Does this work? Yeah. So my question is rather technical and concerns the example you gave. Which book did you read, for instance? So you indicated that the displacement of the copy, which book is a phenomenon purely related to the internal language and prior, even historically, to externalization. Isn't that correct? And
which book? Yeah. The which book did you read? Case displacement.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what I have a trouble to understand is why would internal language care about moving which book to the region of C? So I understand that for linearization purposes, you might need phases and you might need displacement. But why would internal language uses some feature, some syntactic feature on which book that triggers a structural displacement to the region of C? That would seem to be unnecessary.
Why does internal language automatically use structural displacement with copies? Is that the question?
That is the question, but I'd be especially interested if you could address the question of movement to the region of C, because it does have some...
Why did the simplest possible evolutionary process lead to this?
Especially if it's prior to externalization.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so just think it through. The simplest computational operation that evolution would have fixed upon right away before it tried anything else is merge. It says take two objects. Any recursive procedure, anyone, is going to say take objects already formed and form a new one. That's recursive procedures. That's what gives digital infinity, okay? Now the simplest operation says take two objects already formed, make a new one without changing the two that you started with. If there's no changes, it's computationally more simple. Okay, that happens to be set formation. So the simplest computational operation is, in effect, set formation. Take X and Y and form the set containing X and Y. Okay? Now suppose you formed X and you want to make a bigger thing. There's two choices logically possible. One is to take Y that's distinct from X. The other is to take Y that's internal to X. There's no other possibilities. And those two are automatically available. If you take Y external to X, say X is read and Y is which books, you form read which books. That's called external merge. Now, suppose you take Y which is internal to X. So let's say you've already formed in the computational operation, read which books, okay? I forgot what the sentence was, but the boys read which books. You formed that. And you take which books, which is internal to that, and you merge it. You get which book the boys read which book, okay? That's displacement with copies. So why? Because that's the simplest possible thing. To bar it, you'd have to put a stipulation. Comes automatically. It follows automatically from the definition of the simplest operation. Again, the simplest operation will take X already given, look for something new to merge for X. The new thing can either be external to X or internal to it. That's just logic, okay? Pure logic. If it's internal to it, you get displacement with copies. So it follows from pure logic that you're going to get displacement with copies unless you explicitly bar something, stipulate that you can't get it, okay? And of course, that would be a further complication. I mean, if you look at modern linguistics back from the 50s, displacement was always regarded by me too as some kind of strange imperfection of language. Like, why should language have this weird thing? And there's a whole, you know, the literature, there's a whole literature about what's called reconstruction, which tries to explain why the displaced thing is interpreted in the place where you don't hear it. All of that turns out to be just a mistake. It all follows from the simplest computational operation, the one that evolution would have hit upon instantly as the first choice. It's basically the null hypothesis. So if evolution worked as simply as possible, which is what of course we'd expect, then you would get displacement with copies. Then comes the second point. Why don't you pronounce the copies? So what reaches the mind, no externalization, is which book the boys read which book. That's what reaches the mind. You get the right interpretation. Similarly, in the anaphor case that I gave, whatever the example was, which girls do the boys expect to meet each other? What the mind is going to hear is which boys expect which boys to meet each other. Then you get local anaphora in the mind, but not in the ear. The ear hears these things with elimination of one of the copies. In fact, all of the copies in a complex sentence. They're all not articulated. And the reason for that is because externalization also tries to meet the condition of computational efficiency. Doesn't care about communicative efficiency. Language is badly designed for communication in many ways, but it's perfectly designed, it seems, for computational efficiency. And computational efficiency says eliminate as many copies as possible. Then there's much less computational work. And in fact, that means eliminate them all but one. Actually, it's a little more complex than that. In some languages, there's a kind of a trace left, a phonologically articulated trace left of the point where the copies were. It shows up in interesting ways in different languages. But pretty much you eliminate all of them except one. And all of this is just computational efficiency. And it happens to yield the complex array of consequences that we see. And it also yields problems of parsing, perception. Makes it hard. That's in fact the main problem of automatic parsing systems. When you hear which book's in the front of a sentence, how do you know where to interpret it? Of course, nothing's pronounced. Filler gap problem, so-called. So if language was designed for use, for communicative efficiency, you wouldn't have any of this. You wouldn't have structure dependence. You wouldn't have structural ambiguity. You wouldn't have garden path sentences and so on. You wouldn't have islands. But when language is designed for computational efficiency, these are the things you get. And it just doesn't matter that it's hard to use. That's contrary to what's been almost reflexively assumed, but the evidence is pretty strong, I think.
3 questions. First, 1, 2, 3. 4 questions, okay.
So I have a clarification question of something that you said at the beginning. So you mentioned the fact that clicks are available only in the population, in the sum population, as an evidence that internal language might have evolved before externalization. So externalization was later. I missed the link with the existence of clicks.
The link with?
Clicks.
I did not understand the link between the development of clicks in the same population.
The clicks?
Yes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So this is Rini Heibrecht's work. Here are the facts. The fact that pretty well-known facts. Modern humans, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, appears around 200,000 years ago, okay? Genomic studies have now established quite firmly that the San people, speak the Khoisan languages in southern Africa, separated from other human groups roughly 150,000 years ago, something on that order, okay? So almost immediately with the appearance of modern humans. They have the same internal language capacity, but they have different, crucially different kinds of languages. These are the languages that have clicks. No other ones do. They're irrelevant exceptions. So all of these languages have clicks, which are unique phonetically. No other languages have them. There's some evidence for adaptation of the alveolar ridge that makes it easier to produce clicks. All right, let's put all this together. It tells us that internal, and incidentally, a final fact, in the archaeological record, which of course is scanty, maybe more will be discovered, but in the existing archaeological record, the evidence for existence of symbolic behavior, complex family structures, the notations indicating astronomical events not long after that creative art. All of that is around 75,000 years or more recently. So the creative art is maybe 50,000 years. So it's roughly that period. Well, put all this together, what does it look like? It looks as though internal language came along with Homo sapiens or else very shortly after. These are tiny periods in evolutionary time. So it looks like the capacity for internal language came along virtually with Homo sapiens. Now, the sensory motor systems had been around for hundreds of thousands of years, okay? Now, there was a problem of, just from, logic, forgetting the Hoisan, some rewiring of the brain must have taken place, maybe what Friederike is proposing, but some rewiring of the brain. That would be in an individual, not in a group, right? That individual would have had something like a language of thought. Okay, that gives that individual could reflect, could plan, could interpret, all the things we do with our internal thought. Others couldn't. Some selectional advantage to that. The change is passed on partially to future generations. These are very small breeding groups. There probably weren't more than around maybe 10,000 humans around at the time in separate groups. Some group, it might have dominated the group. At that point, there becomes a reason for externalization. Everybody has the same, or a lot of people, the same internal thing, but no, they're not interacting. So you have to invent a system of externalization. Incidentally, we now know that isolated groups of humans, deaf humans, like in Nicaragua, Nicaraguan Sign Language, or Yemen, isolated, even children, young children, without any linguistic input, automatically invent languages, which are, as far as we know, same as everybody else's language, except they use sign instead of speech. Okay? Going back to the San people, the evidence there suggests that externalization came after, well after the separation. The logical analysis indicates that, logical from the point of view of evolutionary theory, indicates that that must have been what happened, so it all falls together. It combines with the fact that externalization seems to be the locus, the primary, maybe total locus of variety, complexity, and mutability. The internal system seems to be very uniform. The more we learn, the more uniform it is. And some of the discoveries are pretty surprising. So you go back, say, about 40 years, it was pretty generally assumed in generative grammar that there's some very striking puzzles, although it was pretty clear that languages observe structure dependence. It seemed as if there were languages with free word order and no structure. In fact, that was thought to be the case of German and Japanese back, say, around 1970. And then when Ken Hale started bringing up evidence from Australian Aboriginal languages, it looked pretty extreme. Walbury is the famous case, which looks almost totally free, no structure. Work like Mark Baker's on polysynthetic languages seem to be showing the same thing. Pretty dramatic discoveries have been made. It's been found that these languages, Japanese and German, was shown a long time ago, but Walbury, more recently, last 15 years, by Ken and one of his students, Julie Legate, that these languages, although there's nothing observed, they do observationally seem to be just throwing words around freely. Turns out that when you look at more subtle characteristics, like, say, anaphor and so on, they have the same hierarchical structures. So it seems, though they're not visible. All of this falls together, seems to indicate that the internal system just evolved, maybe along with humans. Later on, it became externalized, and externalization is a hard problem. It's taking two unrelated systems and trying to link them up. One of them is the internal system, which seems to be computationally maybe close to optimal. The other is sensory motor systems, which have absolutely nothing to do with language, like sign This has nothing to do with language, nor does the vocal tract. They're around forever. The auditory systems are common to primates, and you have to link these things. That's a hard problem. It can be done in a lot of different ways. That gives you the variety of languages. Going back to the sun, the evidence there again, Rini Hoibergs has a paper coming out on this, but this is essentially the story. The separation from other humans is maybe on the order of 150,000 years ago. The externalization is unique to them, not others. And the evidence for symbolic behavior is maybe 50, 75,000 years after that. The only way that makes any sense out of all of this is that they're the same as everyone else in the internal system, but along the way, after they separated, they externalized and they did it their own way, different from the way everyone else externalized. That's the way it seems to fall together. I mean, there's plenty of gaps here. The archaeological record is scanty. You may discover new things and so on.
Autre question. Donc, il y avait une question là-bas, oui, c'est ça. Il y avait...
You described the language of thought. You talked about the language of thought, and you said that you thought of semantically interpreted representations in the mind or something like that. At the same time, you denied that human concepts are referential or refer to anything in the outside world. So my question is, what do you mean exactly by semantically interpreted when you talk about the language of thought?
Semantically interpreted?
Yes, for the language of thought. What does it mean? Is this a matter of connections to the sensory motor system too?
Okay, so the computation, an internal language, like any computational system, is starting with certain atoms of computation. Now, like atoms, they can be analyzed internally in other ways, but for the point of view, from the perspective of the computation, they're atoms. So this would be things like river, or tree, or expect, or so on, things like that. The computational operation makes complex structural objects out of these. The complex structural objects have a meaning. So you construct which books did the boys read. It's going to have a meaning. The meaning will be read off from the fact that what you have is which books the boys read which books, which means essentially which are the books such that the boys read those books. That's a thought, okay, or at least the basis for a thought. You make it a full thought, you have to bring in other world knowledge and so on. But that's the framework of a thought. And the language is constructing infinitely many of those. That's the language of thought.
I understand that that's the language of thought, but then we need, for the thoughts to have meanings, the atoms must have meanings too. And given that you said that the atoms don't refer, there is no representation relation between the atoms and other things out there.
So take again.
So the semantic, what does it mean for the atoms to be semantically
interpreted?
Meaning,
right. All of this derives from the meanings of the atoms and the structural relations that are built up from the computational process. So what is the meaning of the atoms? Well, I'm just talking now about the simple ones, the ones that are used in the act of referring. Referring is an action, right? So I can refer to that thing over there as the Seine, let's say. What exactly is the relation between the word river or Seine, a specific name, and that thing over there? That's Heraclitus' question, okay? So if you cross the Seine this morning and again this afternoon, why is it the same river? Well, when you look at that question, it turns out to have many puzzling properties, such as the ones I mentioned. Radical changes in the object will leave it as the same river. Almost undetectable changes in the object, like a phase change that hardens the surface, and different forms of usage, different forms of usage will make it not a river at all. Actually, this is a point noticed by Aristotle. Aristotle discussed the concept house. Actually, he did it in metaphysical terms. We'll drop that. By the 17th century, this was reinterpreted in cognitive terms, the way it should be. So I'll do that. So take the word house, Aristotle's case. In his metaphysics, house is, the concept house consists of two dimensions, form and matter. Okay, so the matter of the house is bricks, stones, timber, and so on. The form of the house is the intention of the designer, the way it's regularly used, and so on. So if the designer had in mind something else, maybe the designer had in mind a garage, okay, then it's a garage. It may look exactly like a house, but that doesn't matter. What matters is partly that, of course. That's the matter part. But what matters is the intention of the designer and the characteristic use. And that seems to be true for everything, which means that part of the meaning of the simplest words, those are used to refer, is our ways of thinking about the concept. That's distinct from, say, apes and monkeys, or any animal we know, where the symbolic elements do relate to some physically identifiable phenomenon. So if you take, say, a monkey, which has a warning call, leaves are moving, so you issue the warning call. There's a relation between that call and the motion of leaves. If you think of, say, a physicist trying to discover what meaning is by looking just at the symbol and what's referred to, the physicist could figure that out. You could see that whenever the leaves move in a certain way, you get such and such a call. That's universal for non-human languages, non-human symbolic systems. For humans, it won't work. You can't look at the symbol river and the object over there, and from that determine when the symbol is going to be used to refer to the object. You have to know what's going on in the mind of the speaker. That's the core meaning. When you get to more complex notions like, expect or want or desire, any more complex notion is going to be even more remote. But for the simple ones, the ones that are used to refer, it's already totally different from animals. And again, the evolutionary origin of these concepts is a complete mystery.
Une autre question, donc il y avait une question là et une là aussi, oui, monsieur.
Hey, hello sir. Nice to meet you and thank you for what you did.
Who's talking? Oh, okay.
When I first arrived in linguistic courses, my teacher in the lesson told me that there is Aborigine, I think it's Australian language, where they, instead of saying you're in front of me or they are at the left of me, they say you're in the northeast of me and he's at the south. And those people, if you put them in a room, like a dark room, they're gonna know where the north is, and instantly. And so I would like to know if you have like an explanation or something for that.
Yeah, I caught part of that. This is an Australian language, which...
Yeah, I think it's an Aboriginal Australian language.
He's talking about an Aboriginal language.
Yeah, Aboriginal, which has what
left,
property?
Where they situate themselves with north, left, south.
North, left.
And when
yeah.
they're in a room, in
well,
dark,
that's been proposed. Yeah, that's been proposed, but I think it's been debunked. There's work, especially by Lila Gleitman, very fine cognitive psychologist, psycholinguist, who redid these studies and showed that, she's at the University of Pennsylvania, she showed that graduate students at the University of Pennsylvania, under the right conditions, do the same thing.
You mean in a dark room?
In a dark room.
Without
she basically replicated the experiments, taking away specific irrelevancies, and she found essentially the same results.
Okay.
This, I can't give the reference offhand, but you can, if you look up her work, Lila Gleitman, was interesting work.
Okay. Thank you.
Nous pouvons peut-être prendre une dernière question, mais rapide, parce que nous devons absolument avoir quitté la salle dans 5 minutes.
That's the last question. We can quick. We need to leave in 5 minutes.
In a 2004 scientific interview, I'm here. You said corpus linguistics is meaningless, and you gave a very interesting comparison. You said, suppose physics and chemistry, instead of relying on experiments, they would collect huge videotapes of everything that's happening in the world in the hope of coming up with generalizations. And you concluded by saying sciences don't do that. In the light of recent progress in causal inference in biostatistics,
in what?
Causal inference.
Causal inference?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which modern corpus linguistics taps into. Would you confirm this view?
Could the recent research in causal inference yield some of these results? Is that the question?
It is the question, and in fact, the link between a sample and the inference we make from a sample.
Inference from samples?
Yeah, that's what corpus linguistics is about, and that's what some physics is about.
Yeah. It's virtually impossible. First of all, there's no results, but you can see in advance why there are not going to be any results. So take any of the cases that I mentioned, starting, let's say, with word meaning. Okay, let's start with river, since I mentioned that. The properties of river that I mentioned, which are known to every child and are universal among languages, cannot be derived from analysis of data because the child has no data. None. For the things I mentioned, there's just no data. Take structure dependence. Again, instinctively, eagles that fly swim, where we know reflexively that instinctively goes with swim, the remote verb, structurally closest but linearly remote. There's no evidence for that, no empirical evidence, and children know it as soon as we can test them, age 3. How can you get that from analysis of data? And it goes on like that. One example that I mentioned is kind of striking. Charles Yang's recent observation that children typically, if any child knows the inflectional paradigms, they get that very quickly, but they don't hear them. They hear only parts of them. Statistically, it's extremely unlikely that somebody will have heard the full paradigm. Things just aren't that frequent, you know. Anywhere you look, it turns out that what's known is not accessible by analysis, by pure analysis of data. Of course, data does something. Like data tells you that in English it's river, but not in French. You know? The Saussurean arbitrariness, as it's called, that's pretty totally arbitrary, almost totally arbitrary. So some things are clearly learned. And more is learned than that. So take river again. It's not that when people say it's a cultural product, that's not totally false. Like in English, there's a difference between river, stream, creek, you know, a couple of other things. Other languages may not have exactly those differences. They'll have some other set of differences. So in what should be called semantic fields, you know, domains in which a group of words roughly fit, this studied mainly by German linguists years ago. Within semantic fields, you get some different organization of the field. So the words like, say, know, believe, think, and so on won't be exactly the same. They're not exactly the same in French and English, and certainly not in more remotely languages that are more remote. So there'll be some differences in the way the fields are cut up, and some other small differences, which are learned. You have to learn in English that a certain thing is a river and another thing is a stream, not a river. Some other language may not make that distinction, or may make some other distinction. Similarly, you have to, in simple cases like, say, color words, there are some universals, but there are languages which just don't have, say, the same richness of color words that we do, and other languages have even richer ones, okay? But it turns out that the people who don't have the words nevertheless have the conceptual structure. Now, this was shown by Ken Hale pretty strikingly in some papers back in the 1970s in studying a wide range of Australian Aboriginal languages. So there are many languages in which you don't have number words beyond, say, 2, 3, 4. But it turns out that the people have all the concepts. They may not have the word 5, but they can show things like this, okay? They may not have the word red, but they can say blood-like, so they have other ways of doing it. And in fact, it turns out these are what he calls cultural gaps, that the cultural gaps are exhibited in choice of words, but they apparently don't show up in the conceptual systems.
Thank you very much again.